Hello and welcome back. Hope everyone had with one at the event floor. We're going to start with our third session. And our third session is qualifications-based selection in the procurement of professional design services. Obtaining best life cycle value for an infrastructure asset requires analysis and key decision making during the planning and design phases. It is during these phases that the greatest impact on life cycle value can be had for the lowest cost. Using low price selection for those design services, however, significantly impedes the ability to realize the greatest life cycle value. The qualifications-based selection process unlocks that value. Today's panelists are going to discuss procurement process issues and concerns where low price is a dominant factor and describe qualifications-based approaches that result not only in better life cycle value, but better project delivery. The benefits of QBS and its approach will be detailed. I'm going to introduce the moderator for today's session, which is Sandro Perusa. He's the CEO of the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers, which is the advocacy and member services organization for the engineering profession in Ontario. Sandro also serves on the board of directors for the Minerva Canada and is currently past chair of the CDAO. Prior to OSPI, Sandro was the Chief of Client Services at Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, the largest health and safety association in Canada, where he was a sitting member of the Ontario Ministry of Labour's Prevention Operations Forum. He has been recognized for building inclusive workspaces, high-performing teams, and a culture based on trust and mutual respect. And I can tell you firsthand, he walks and lives that. I took over the chair role from Sandro at the CDAO table, and he was really great at handing me that torch and being there in the background to support. So Sandro, I'm going to hand it over to you for this session.
Thank you for the kind word, Sharon. It's I don't know, when you have people read your bio, you're somewhat embarrassed somehow. I don't know if I feel that way. So, and now it's my pleasure to actually introduce our speakers, our knowledge experts, and read their bio. So hopefully I do a good job as well as Sharon did for myself. So again, these are the experts. So I'm going to have them speak as much as possible. My role is really try to facilitate the process and make sure that I take your questions and feed them to the moderator or to the panelists. So first up, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Bruce Matthews, professional engineer. Bruce is executive director at the Association of Consultant Engineering Companies of Ontario, a graduate of systems design engineering at the University of Waterloo. Prior to joining ACC Ontario, Bruce worked with a number of regulatory organizations, including Professional Engineers Ontario, the Real Estate Council of Ontario, the College and Association of Registered Nurses of Alberta, and the Ontario Colleges of Trades. Bruce believes that while initial personal and organizational success can come from many factors, continued success is a function of embracing change, and he does live that as well. Also on the panel, it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. John Stevenson, architect, also representing not only the founding partner of Forum Studio Architects, but also the Ontario Association of Architects. He's a founding and past managing partner of Forum Architectural Engineering, now Forum Studio Architects in Thunder Bay. John Stevenson has over 40 years of experience in the practice of architecture. And before relocating to Thunder Bay in 1980, he focused on urban design, nonprofit and cooperative housing projects in Toronto. In addition to serving on many OAA committees and task forces over his career, John has been on the Council of the Ontario Association of Architects over the past 7 years, serving as co-chair of the Interns Forum, vice president of communications, and senior vice president and treasurer, and served 2 terms as OAA president in 2017 and 2018. And finally, it's really important that we have a general contractor's perspective on this. So we're very fortunate to have with us Mr. Angelo Cofini, professional engineer. Angelo is the vice president of operations ICI at the Ellis Don Corporation. And since joining Ellis Don in 1990, Angelo has led teams and managed major construction projects across a number of sectors. Angel's main focus is on the institutional, cultural, and recreational portfolio projects in the Greater Toronto Hamilton area. And some of his projects, I'm not going to list them all because we'd be here all day, includes the University of Toronto, both with St. George and Scarborough campuses, McMaster, Humber College, Mohawk College, the Stratford Festival's Tom Patterson Theatre, roof replacements at the Rogers Centre, the practice and training facilities for the Toronto Raptors, again, just to name a few. To date, Angel's managed well over $2.5 billion of work for Ellis Don, or again, $2.5 billion. And not only that, Angel also won Ellis Don Annual Safety Award in both 2011 and again in 2020. And during all his free time that he has, he's also an instructor at the University of Toronto School of Continuing Studies and sits on the board of directors for the Ontario General Contractors Association. Oh my goodness, Angela, where do you have time? You must have a clone or a twin brother or something. So,
Thanks, Bruce.
so with that, wow, what am I doing with all my free time? It's my pleasure to start off by passing this off to Bruce Matthews, who's going to give an introduction to qualifications-based selection and why we're all proponents for it. So, Bruce, please.
Super. Hopefully, everyone is now seeing my screen, and it's a little bit small there, I think, just because of the window I'm working off of, but we'll work with this. So yeah, I just want to give sort of a high level overview of what is it we mean when we talk about qualifications-based selection, or QBS. The name gets thrown around quite a bit, but there's some different perspectives on it that I thought we'll just cover off right now. So ultimately comes down to, the challenges that I'm going to deal mostly with public sector procurers here. They have in terms of meeting the societal needs of their electorate, for lack of a better word, and in doing that, in delivering infrastructure projects, wanting to ensure things are done on a timely basis, clearly want to being concerned about the public purse and taxpayer dollars and being responsible from that perspective, and yet still wanting to do things that reflect quality and innovation and sort of the latest and greatest. So, back in the day, we would sort of talk about the fact, and again, I worked as a consultant, is the idea of, the customer wants it fast, they want it cheap, and they want it good. You usually get to pick two. I'd kind of like to suggest that with QBS, it might actually be that we can sort of balance out these three things and get all of it done reasonably well. The essence here for QBS is that procurement is really what it's all about. QBS is about the procurement of consulting services, typically engineering, architecture, et cetera, that relate to project design. It is not a function in any way, shape, or form of project delivery. So the project delivery method really is secondary to all of this. But once that consultant is under contract, then your actual QBS process is done. But the good news is, the benefit of having used a QBS process is going to ultimately impact positively the balance of the project in terms of its delivery, and that is regardless of the delivery method. This is probably a pie chart that many folks are quite familiar with, that looks at the proportion of cost in the life cycle of a particular infrastructure asset relative to the, and I labeled down at the bottom as engineering, but that's really meant to be the design phase, really small, 1 to 3%, depending generally. Construction, it might be another 10, 15, 20 maybe, but largely the costs associated with an infrastructure asset are all coming down to operations and maintenance. And yet, in thinking of that, and when you want to add value to that project, when is the opportunity to add project in terms of your ability to actually have influence? And as this graph shows, it's during the design phase, and this flows just naturally from what was said at the last session, by Giovanni, in terms of having that impact early relative to, if you're trying to do something and make a change or add value during construction, and then lastly, obviously during operations and maintenance, your ability to have real influence from a value perspective is pretty limited. And the same sort of graph works the other way when you look at what is the cost associated with it. So if you want to make some sort of a change that's going to enhance the value of your project, doing it in the design phase, is the lowest cost, exponentially higher, order of magnitude higher during construction, and once again during operation and maintenance. So there should be no real surprise here. I think people would generally agree that this is the way that that reality works. When we talk about qualifications-based selection, it's, well, what's the option? The other option is basically a price-based selection. unfortunately, in people who, often, and I understand this in political circles, is you're spending taxpayer dollars, but there's a process that tends to confuse lowest price for best value. And I think that is one of the most fundamental things we want to communicate today, is that, if you've got that mindset, that's what we want to shake people off of, is to think that that price somehow equates to value. And ultimately, if you have that perspective, you're ultimately treating your consulting and design services, frankly, as a commodity. The idea where, if you're going to buy more, you should be paying less, and treating it as if you're buying paper clips or gravel or some other sorts of, pure material, and you don't think of it as an intellectual property that you're purchasing. It also assumes, from a price-based perspective, that everyone is pretty much all the same, right? All the service providers are pretty much equal, and I think, and then we'll see this as we discuss further. This is the big opportunity to make some difference with respect to QBS, and of course, price-based selections tend to get bogged down in process. They don't really tend to focus very much on the outcomes you're trying to achieve at the end of the day in terms of getting the best life cycle value out of your asset. You get down into the use of the process. And ultimately, in taking that approach to selection, you're going to be encouraging a very minimalist interpretations of project scope, which is part of what we discussed just the last section, so that people will bid low numbers to do that. You'll potentially be assigning less experienced staff to keep those dollar signs down, but it also penalizes the firms that actually can anticipate the project complexities to avoid the problems you're going to have down the line. And if they build that into their proposal, they know it's going to be more expensive, and they're not going to be the ones that are selected. So ultimately, your price-based selection is sacrificing that life cycle value picture, long range, in the name of ultimately short-term cost savings. So in terms of what is QBS exactly, it is a process by which, generally speaking, design services are procured. And I'm going to quote here from something known as the Brooks Act. And this is a piece of legislation that was passed federally in the United States, and it's kind of the cornerstone of what we now refer to as QBS. But essentially, it's legislation that requires in the states for federal projects for the procurement of architecture and engineering services, that it be done on the basis of demonstrated competence and qualifications for the type of professional services that are required, and being done at fair and reasonable prices. And we're going to come back and stress those terms a lot, I think, over the course of this session. And then for each procurement, then you end up selecting or identifying the most highly qualified firms. You rank them, you go through a process then of negotiation, and ultimately, deal with the most qualified firm. And if you can't agree on price issues, someone's asking if I can zoom in on the slides. Actually, let me see what I can do here. I've got one small possibility. Does that help at all?
Bruce, just
Yes.
for the viewers, if you are looking at Bruce's his slide deck, there are 4 arrows at the top right-hand corner. You can actually blow up on your own screen what Bruce has shared. So and that's an individual thing that every viewer can do.
Yep.
So
Thanks very much, Sharon. Appreciate that. Yeah, I think it's the fact that I've got my slides presented on a gigantic screen, and it's sort of proportionally showing that. Anyway, the just getting back into this process of dealing with the most highly qualified firms, and then negotiating based on fair and reasonable prices. And again, if you're not able to reach a satisfactory agreement with that top ranked firm, you go down to the next one, and so on and so forth. So it's ultimately a process that's intended to achieve as an outcome real life cycle value, because you're going to have in your design phase the folks who are going to be aware of, essentially it's a risk minimization issue as it relates to both cost and schedule issues. So the other thing in looking at, all right, who is out there using QBS right now? As I noted earlier, there's something called the Brooks Act, such that federally in the United States, it is the law that it has to be used. That law has also been adopted by about 45 of the individual state governments for state level procurement of design services. There are various municipalities across the US who have also adopted that. Here in Canada, we've got the City of Calgary is a very strong proponent. The City of London has used it from now and again, not on a consistent basis, but they've done that. Metrolinx toyed with it a little bit a number of years back. City of Waterloo also did a pilot as well. But I am told that in Quebec, as an example, there is legislation that does require any of the provincial agencies to use QBS for engineering and architectural services. So there's a number of folks who recognized it well enough to actually enshrine it in legislation. Now, there is actually some research that supports the concepts behind QBS. The primary one being a 2009 joint study, US based again, but from the Georgia Institute of Technology and the University of Colorado. There was an update to this study published in 2022 that still carried forward similar results and ultimately showed that projects where QBS was the method of selecting for the design engineering services had 70% less cost growth than the ones that didn't use QBS, and had 20% less schedule slippage. So again, I'm not sure, no one's here is going to try and sell you that QBS is a panacea for all problems related to schedule and cost, but it is an excellent risk mitigation approach. And more so importantly, as the last bullet here shows, that the QBS is especially favored on projects that have higher complexity and therefore higher perceived risk. There was additional research done, of course. We just talked about the Ryerson research that was procured by CDAO between 2018 and 21. That indeed also showed that any time and effort invested during your planning and design phase, which will come naturally through a QBS process, is going to result in efficiencies during project delivery. And again, this whole order of magnitude relationship between making that change pre-design, during design, during construction, or worse yet, during implementation, or excuse me, during operations and maintenance is a key factor. So just to summarize with respect to this introduction, QBS is a competitive and a transparent process. There are obviously people who sometimes have concern, oh, we're only negotiating with one. Well, you're not. You've identified a number of qualified or potentially qualified firms, and you're just saying we are going to prioritize qualifications and then get ourselves to fair and reasonable pricing on that. It does focus on merit and quality and ultimately on life cycle value. It's not that short-term focus of trying to spend as little as possible during the process of design or spending as little as possible during construction. It does ensure ultimately some level of cost effectiveness, certainly as compared to other approaches. It lowers risks for complex projects. It actually encourages innovation on the part of the designers, which is ultimately part of a win-win for both the client and the consulting firm. So, Sandro, I'm going to leave it at that and stop sharing my screen, and we'll take it on to the others.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. So we've heard from the consultant engineering perspective of why QBS is, what it is. There's a primer, and based on the Ryerson study and a session earlier, why it's so important. But now we're going to go to John Stevenson and hear from an architect's perspective, but also from OAA's perspective. So the Ontario Association of Architects is a regulator, and their primary focus is the public interest. So why, John, is OAA behind QBS? So I'll pass it on to you now.
Thanks, Sandro. Yeah, happy to jump in and bring those two perspectives to the conversation. I just wanted to make a few introductory comments to speak to those perspectives and to, in part, start answering the question you just posed. First, a little bit about the OAA. I know you've heard from Christy Doyle, our executive director, in an earlier session, so I won't go on at length about the OAA, and I don't have time for that. But the OAA, as Sandro mentioned, is responsible for the regulation of the practice of architecture under the mandate given it by the Architects Act of Ontario. That responsibility includes determining who can be an architect based on their education, experience, examinations. The OAA is responsible for setting out professional performance standards and for keeping architects accountable through practice support, continuing education complaints and discipline processes, and so on. It's also responsible for preventing unqualified individuals from practicing architecture. And it does this all in the public interest, as Sandra mentioned. And the actual language in the Act says you do all this to serve and protect the public interest. However, the public interest in this context is much more than just about public safety. For example, making sure the buildings don't leak, fall down, or they don't put people's lives at risk. The OAA tries to capture this broader notion of the public interest through its vision statement, which talks about a world that is full of safe and healthy built environments that perform at the highest levels and elevate the human spirit. So this broader notion of the public interest is kind of fundamental to the reasons why the OEA supports QBS as a preferred method of procurement. The OEA takes the view that it's in this broader public interest that architects and their teams are empowered by an appropriate design brief, a fair contract, and reasonable compensation to reach for these higher goals through a creative and innovative design process. I think it's important to recognize that design itself is not a commodity, and creativity and innovation can't be boiled down to an easily definable set of requirements that can be produced at the lowest cost. We're not manufacturing widgets here. This is a creative journey that we're collaborating on as we work together with clients. And that design journey is a journey of exploration, and the best outcomes often arise from the unexpected twists and turns in that journey. I also want to emphasize too that architecture, to dispel a common myth, is not a luxury product, but rather it's a social necessity and a social art that searches for design solutions that reach for positive social and environmental outcomes, while at the same time satisfying the client's design brief. This search for innovation and design excellence is labor intensive, and it often unfolds in unpredictable and surprising ways. So in the OEA's view, the broader public interest is best served by a QBS procurement process that empowers architects and their design teams to fully explore these twists and turns of the design process, ultimately to the benefit of their clients and the community. The OEA sees the following benefits. It promotes a healthy and stable profession. It enhances public trust and appreciation for architecture. It's supportive of climate action and design innovation. It upholds fairness and accountability, as Bruce has talked about, and it's responsive to the interests of the public, which are looking for a built environment that is sustainable, equitable, accessible, and inspirational, and not just procured at the lowest cost. So what's the practitioner's perspective on this question? When we see in our practice conventional RFPs with any price component, no matter how small, we understand that after the technical evaluation, there will likely be a group of firms that are very closely scored. And we understand as well that as a result of that, the ultimate differentiator will be price, even if price is as little as 5 or 10% of the evaluation criteria. We ask ourselves then, as we examine these opportunities, how low can we go on the fee and still get from the beginning to the end of the project in the straightest path, managing the risks and still meeting the client expectations. We also kind of ironically ask ourselves if the client really understands what the project requirements are and are their expectations realistic. All of this we do without any meaningful engagement with the client during the procurement process to enable and look for a full and proper understanding of the project's real needs. Ultimately, it's a guess, but in the end, our desire and need for the work often pits the fee calculation against what we suspect the project really needs in terms of effort in order to meet the broader public interest. In our view, this is neither in the client's or the public's best interests. Problems with lowest price approach, Bruce has highlighted some of them. At risk of repeating, I'll say that it does reward firms with using fewer resources on behalf of the client. For example, less experienced, less senior staff. It penalizes firms with a greater appreciation of the client's need. Penalizes firms that accurately anticipate the complications or that propose innovation in respect to the project goals. And ultimately, it risks increasing costs to the client through their need to apply more staff time and resources to solving the problems that will unfold from a low fee-based approach to design procurement. QBS, in our view, offers really solid solutions to these challenges and problems. If you look at the procurement exercise from a project outcomes perspective, through a proper QBS procurement, the client will get inevitably the right team for the right job. In other words, the highest ranked team is the one that the client believes can design a project that will best achieve their objectives. And a detailed scope of services can then be established in consultation with the preferred team, including deliverables and schedules that will produce the best results in achieving the client's objectives. We're not guessing any longer about what it is that is really required and basing our fee on that guesswork. It will help generate more realistic schedules and budgets, and it will enable the client and the consulting team to negotiate a fair fee and a realistic project schedule to enable it to deliver the desired scope and quality of services. And inevitably, as the research has indicated, it will generate fewer change orders and disputes during the construction process, and greatly minimize the cost of resolving the ambiguities and errors that flow and omissions that flow from documents that are less than thorough and complete. It will result in better business relationships between the client and consultants, contractors, and external agencies, and better service, better quality, and better value for the client. So that's sort of an overview. I do want to highlight, though, that there are some risks associated with QBS from a practitioner's perspective that I think need to be kept in mind. And one qualifier in my mind is that a properly designed QBS process needs to ensure that qualifications being evaluated are focused in a very balanced way, both on past results and on future prospects for success. Qualification evaluations that are focused solely on past projects within too narrow a definition of similarity may result in excluding excellent innovative practitioners that don't have deep and current portfolios in a specific project type, but may have current project experience in different building types that can be related to the project at hand. That's something to guard against. Qualifications evaluations also need to consider the proposed approach and ideas for the project in terms of how they demonstrate the capacity of the design team to reach for excellence and innovation in the current assignment. Without a balanced consideration of both past performance and forward-looking ideas, the result can limit the competition to a too narrow pool of competitors, eliminating from consideration many potentially excellent design teams. This is very much how one would go about hiring a critical employee. You'd look at their educational and employment background, and you'd also interview them about how they would approach the work and their relationships with their coworkers. Hiring a design team should be no different in our view. It is, after all, a human resource that is being retained. Going back to the HR analogy on a more crass level, you wouldn't think of choosing an employee based on who would work for the lowest wage. Choosing a design team should be no different.
Okay, thank you very much. And next, but certainly not least, we get a general contractor's perspective. So Angelo Cofini, again with Ellis Dunn, has worked on $2.5 billion worth of projects. So a vast amount of experience. General contractors work between the owners, the consultants, the supply chain. They're managing the entire project. So Angelo, from your perspective and with your experience, why do you prefer a QBS system?
Thank you, Sandro. I want to start by clarifying that my career started in the late 90s, not 1990s. So I'm not as old as I look. So I like to start by saying a few facts that, like to state a few facts that we're all aware of. For a project to be successful, the right firms have to be selected. We know that projects are not all the same. Every project is unique and requires firms that have those unique skills and experiences. To procure a project solely on low price, you're going to be attracting firms who potentially don't have the required experience, and much like what John stated, it will lead to all kinds of issues once we get into the construction phase. Hiring the right firms based on their skills and experience, like I said, in the long run, will yield a much higher product, and that will result in the most competitive price. So the idea behind the low price on bid day, that you've been able to secure your costs is absolutely not correct. Stip some projects from a consultant's point of view, they will lead to all kind of exposures down the line. As a contractor, when we select projects, the first focus we look at is to see which consultants have been selected. And I can assure you that if we see that consultants who have the right experience, are working on that projects, we will do our utmost to try to secure those. For us, it completely incentivizes us because we know that it will reduce the risk and minimize claims. And from a contractor standpoint, you know, our relationship is the most important thing we can have with our consultants, and especially the owner. And finding ourselves in a claim situation goes against everything that we believe in, and it will jeopardize your ability to secure more work in the future. So QBS is the way to go, not only for consultants, and I know here the main focus is, design firms, but even from a contractor standpoint, when we see that an owner has gone through and issued an RFQS to shortlist a number of construction managers who have the experience, there's nothing that we like better, because at least we're competing against like for like. And so from a contractor standpoint, again, I really want to deliver this home. Whenever we see projects that the right consultants with the right experience have been selected, we'll do our utmost to try to secure those projects. I don't know what's that, Sandro.
Perfect, Angelo. That's exactly it. So I'm reading the comments and the questions, and I'll make one comment, that is these sessions are being recorded. So if you want to come back and refer to them later, please do so. So I want to focus on one thing, and again, we have a lot of questions, so you don't need to be long in the answer, but if you can, from your perspective, each one of you, what is the one or two key value propositions of QBS from the owner's perspective or from the public's perspective? And John, I'm going to start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Bruce. Yeah, I mean, I highlighted some of them in my remarks, but the one or two key ones, I think, enhanced design excellence, because the design team is empowered to invest the time and energy in producing not just a thoroughly considered and innovative and creative design in the early stages of design, but also a thorough and complete set of construction documents for tendering and construction purposes, or procurement and construction purposes. At the end of the day, that's the biggest benefit that I can imagine for clients, and achieving that excellence is so important. It also, I think, and this is often lost sight of, it empowers the clients to reach for the kind of project end results that allow them to demonstrate leadership in their role as building owners, in terms of the broader community and the responsibilities they might have to the broader community.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Angelo, I'm going to go to you now. Again, what do you think is one or two? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm going to echo what John just stated. Like I said, when the right consultants who have the right experience have been selected, the documents that are provided are complete for the most part. They're as complete as you can get them, and they're of high quality. And what that does is it allows us to do our work properly. We're able to procure all the subcontractors, but most importantly, what we're able to minimize is scope creep. When documents are not fully complete, there's a lot of gray area that we do our best to capture, but it's very difficult. And the result of that is claims and change orders for the clients. And I can assure you, clients do not like to pay change orders.
That's for sure.
So again,
Bruce, yeah,
quality of documents.
Thank you, Angelo. Bruce, on to you. Oh, you're muted.
There we go. I'm going to just pick up from where Angelo left off, and yet think of it in a slightly more than 30,000 foot level, and think about it from a risk management perspective. Owners are understandably risk averse. They often don't like change, in terms of change orders, but often just the way things are executed, and that's a little bit unfortunate. And I think our intention here is to position QBS as a risk mitigation tool. that by selecting your best qualified and competent service providers in the design sphere, you are actually offsetting risks that would otherwise exist downstream on the project. That issue, risk of change that is going to increase cost or otherwise delay from a schedule point of view. Those are the two big things. And there's a lot can be done through the QBS process that addresses that. The second item I'm going to speak to is ultimately defensibility. In the context of public sector procurements, everyone's afraid about spending the taxpayer dollars and having to justify what they spent back to the taxpayers. And it's understandable. And I think there is an approach here that is defensible that speaks to saying, well, I don't have to be able to say, we spent the least amount of your money possible to get this done, rather than we spent a fair and reasonable amount and acquired the best possible services to get this thing done. So I think QBS is absolutely defensible. It just requires a little bit of a different tack than simply going things to purely on the dollar side. Of course, the John Q public understands the dollars. They may not understand the complexities that are associated with project delivery and why a better qualified firm is going to save the taxpayers in the long run, right? It's a little bit of a tougher sell that way, but I think it's important to stress that QBS, from an owner's perspective, is absolutely defensible.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. I'm reading the questions and the comments. I'm gonna try to kind of put a couple of them together because it actually relates to the next question I have on my docket. So QBS is something that I know ACC Ontario is advocating for. I know OAA is advocating for. My organization, OSPI, is, and in fact, it's one of the core recommendations that CDAO is pushing the government towards, because we all believe in the process, everything from the designers to the constructors. So, and part of that advocacy is towards actually Metrolinx. So they put forward a proposal or a plan, you mentioned in your comments, that they are implementing QBS on a pilot project. So is there one QBS methodology or prescribed model that we should be using for all procurement? I'm going to start with you, Bruce.
Sure. And that's an excellent question. And I must say, our organization, ACEC Ontario, we've been banging the QBS drum for better part of 20 years. And honestly, I haven't had the level of uptake that we really think ought to be there. We are certainly pushing to have public procurers recognize it, either enshrine it in legislation or in policy as the way to approach this stuff. But part of the challenge with that, I think, has been, frankly, we're our own worst enemies, and especially as engineers, we get very detailed oriented, and we tend to prescribe a certain way of doing QBS, and I don't think that's necessarily helpful. There was a website that's set up, yes2qbs.com, provides a lot of good background information and research, and yet it does describe a process, and it describes it in a certain level of detail as this is the way to do QBS. And I know there are people out there who would say, if you're not doing that, you're not doing QBS. And I think we really need to change the narrative a little bit on that with respect to what QBS is, and go back to the fundamental philosophical statement that exists in the Brooks Act. The Brooks Act legislation in the US, it is incredibly brief. It does outline a process, but ultimately, if you print it out, literally, it's the back and front of one sheet of paper, right? And as legislation goes, seeing something that brief is almost hard to believe, but there it is. But it is anchored in that philosophical statement at the start, which is you are going to procure architecture, engineering services, design services on the basis of qualifications and competence for the type of services necessary, and do it at fair and reasonable prices. And I don't know any public procurer who is going to argue against fair and reasonable as a fundamental element of the pricing side of things. We've sat down as an organization with a number of them, and I come to that question. I said, well, would you agree that paying a fair and reasonable price is an acceptable philosophy? Everyone agrees. No one's going to say, "Oh yeah, we're happy being unfair and unreasonable," right? So you need to box them into that, start at that philosophical level, and then get into just that next layer that speaks to the particulars of how you can achieve that through a QBS process without getting terribly prescriptive, because the other thing that this sort of brings about, frankly, is it does mean a change in approach for the individuals who do procurement. They're going to have to learn a slightly different method and a slightly different mindset. And organizations generally and people are change resistant. So this does represent change. And I think the way that we, between the OAA, ourselves, yourselves, Sandro, when we're trying to pitch this, is to make that change seem more manageable, making them realize that indeed the philosophy is again defensible. It's all fair and reasonable. I think that's the essence. So this idea of only one way to do QBS is not something that I would say is fair or valid.
Okay, John, your perspective.
Yeah, I mean, just on the question of the advocacy towards QBS, I would say that I'm aware of a number of pilot projects underway right now. In fact, one in the federal government. I haven't seen much in the way of results over the last little while, but I think PSPC has been piloting QBS for a number of projects. So there is some uptake we are seeing. The other thing I want to mention too is that one of the more interesting projects I'm involved in these days is working with my colleagues across the country to advocate for the adoption of an architecture policy for Canada. And one of the foundational pieces of that guides that advocacy is advocacy for a public interest focused procurement for design services for projects in the built environment. And this is not just about architects and architecture, it's about the broader design industry that develops these projects. And we're hoping to see some uptake through that policy, and early indications are that there is strong support at the federal level, and we hope that this will trickle down to provincial and municipal levels, the municipal level being probably the most important level. So there's lots of work being done there, and I anticipate success over the years coming in advocating.
Okay. And Angelo, I'm going to slightly modify the question for your perspective, because again, you work on private projects and public projects. So looking at all the different projects you work on and being involved in, have you seen different models on the private side that work better than what works on the public side?
The private side is very different than the public side. Obviously, the private side is private money, so they're not held to the same standards that we're held to in the public sector. So the private side, I don't want to call it the Wild West, but it's very difficult to structure them in that way and to change their mind. But on the public side of our work, I think it's important that a clear process is established whereby the firms that are selected are selected and shortlisted based on their experience. Again, we go back to that, right? The right firm is a firm that has the proper experience for that particular project. So, yeah, not to answer your question, not necessarily there isn't one, but they're all a little bit different from one another. But at the end of the day, what ties them all together is that they do a fairly good job and again, I'm talking about who's really good at this are universities and colleges. They do a really good job identifying and shortlisting firms who do have the required experience.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Sandra, if I could jump in too on the issue of the private sector, because we do private sector work as well as public sector work. In my experience, the private sector more often than not pursues an informal version of QBS already. They go to consultants who they know and understand to be expert or experienced in the kind of work that they're undertaking, and they negotiate with those consultants. We sit down at the table with them and have an intelligent conversation about the scope of services that are required, and develop a suite of services and a fee budget and a schedule around those needs, and that's in essence QBS, and it's very effective. The private sector recognizes its effectiveness and supports it. They don't formalize it in the sense that there's a script and a protocol that they follow. They do it in a way that they're comfortable with based on the relationships that they have. So, I mean, I think there's lots of precedent there.
Okay,
Yeah, and actually,
want to
Sandra,
build
I'm
on that.
sorry,
Go
I'm
ahead.
just going to jump
Yeah.
in quickly if you don't mind. Yeah, I think underlying all of this is the understanding and expectation is that you've got a savvy owner, you've got a savvy client. We're not talking about, John Q homeowner here who's looking to have a little bit of work done, and therefore who do they select as their engineer or architect or whatever. We're talking about large, typically public sector, but even in the private side, we're talking about buildings, we're talking about, very, very large, assets that have long life cycles to them. And therefore, it's understood that people involved in the procurement are pretty savvy with respect to what they should expect to be spending and so on. So they'll have a sense of what constitutes fair and reasonable. They know what the budget is. They'll know enough about the nature of the services to be able to make those distinguishing factors about making that informed selection with respect to who are the most qualified. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, is that we're not looking at, again, an uninformed or ill-educated client side here. This is we need to take advantage of the fact that these people know their stuff, and therefore should be in a really good position to evaluate those qualifications and competency aspects.
Okay, thank you. So I just want to build on that just a bit. And again, looking at some of the comments and the questions coming in, there are some entities actually looking at a matrix that includes both qualifications and pricing up front. And some of the challenges they have as well is, it's, you may call a firm, but the actual designers may have changed within that firm. So so first off, let me ask the first question. Looking at that matrix system where they look at scoring and a number of other different perspectives, is that good enough? Is that QBS, or do we need something more structured? Again, John, I'm going to go with you first this time.
Yeah, I would say no, it's not QBS. It's a short and simple answer. Any evaluation matrix that includes price is going to be undermined by that competitive drive that price evaluation induces, and is not going to result in a good outcome from, an equally good outcome to a pure QBS system. It's not to say that price isn't a factor, and Bruce inferred this as well. You begin the QBS process with an informed sense of what the budget should be for the professional services that you're about to require. And you negotiate within that budget and assume that you're going to result in a happy reconciliation of the design team's needs for compensation and your budget. And if you can't, with your preferred consultant, then you say thank you very much, and you move on to the second highest ranked consultant, and you negotiate within that budget again until you find a happy solution. So, price is always a factor in the QBS process. It's just not a price competition. It's not a race to the bottom, in the sense that any price-based procurement process, no matter how small the price component is in the evaluation matrix, tends to generate.
Okay, Bruce?
I certainly agree. What you've described there is absolutely not QBS, and it's been our experience that, and I think John alluded to this in his opening remarks, where even if you've got something at 80-20, 70-30 split, technical versus price, you tend to see on that technical side all your proponents, ranked at a pretty small range. If you're talking out of 70 points, maybe everyone ends up between 60 and 65, and therefore there's no great differentiation. And then suddenly on price, everyone gets ranked between 0 and 30, and price is driving the decision. And the challenge to that is, how can we perhaps help the owners, the buyers, better differentiate among those who are proposing services? And hey, we're an industry association representing 140 consulting engineering firms. I'm going to tell you, yeah, they're all good, but guess what? They're not all the same, right? You can find ways that on a given day, for a given project, for a given need, firm A is going to be seen as better qualified and more competent than firm B. 12 months later, and I know there were some comments here about staff changes and how that all comes into play, But I'm thinking here, you've got to evaluate based on the information you've got available and who they're putting on the table. 12 months later, because there's churn in the industry, it becomes a different, and you might get a different answer. But and therefore, firm B looks now to be a bit better qualified than firm A. So there is dynamics that take place that people have to realize. Just because you're the most qualified today doesn't mean you're always going to be seen that way. I mean, it's good to have that level of competition and to see that rather than a race to the bottom, a race to the top in terms of how the firm is perceived with respect to their qualifications and competencies. So it's that challenge of getting the public procurers to better differentiate on that technical side. I mean, if you've got that, it's still a problem, but at least what will get to the next step to QBS is if you're looking at that better differentiation, you'll more easily create that ranking that says, okay, well, here's the top firm I definitely want to talk to and I want to negotiate with so I can get a fair and reasonable price. I think that's the takeaway.
Okay, perfect. Angel, do you have a perspective on this?
I do. So 50% of my work is design build. So, very often I'm in a position where I'm negotiating and hiring consultants. And I can tell you that we do follow the QBS process where, depending on the opportunity, we select the right firm who we believe is the right firm with the right experience. And I can give you an example. There's a pursuit that we're currently working on, and we identified the architect and the engineers, and we started working. And after about 3 weeks, I called the principals and I said, I think we should start, figuring out what kind of fees you're looking for. So again, it didn't even when we first started working together, the fee didn't even come up. And and that's QBS at its best.
Yeah, excellent. Again, people procured projects in the past have a general sense of what the projects cost, and if the QBS and if the design part is 1 to 3%, it really is a small part of the entire project envelope. So again, you have a general sense of what this project costs, and if you do to approach a firm and they're well outside that budget, then you approach another firm or you approach another group of firms to say, here's what the envelope is. Are you willing to talk to us about a project within this? As opposed to coming saying, here's a set price, take it or leave it. I agree. So we mentioned the Brooks Act and in the US, and again, dating back to 1972. So Andrew, I'm going to start with you on this question. Would you would your preference be that QBS system be mandated the way it is in the States? I know Calgary has a regime that looks at a QBS kind of framework. So would you prefer that this is just regulated or there's a regulatory framework within this, and that way everyone's working off the same process?
I would, Sandro. At the end of the day, the biggest part of our business, all of us, is to mitigate risk and to make a dollar. So for us, the only way we can mitigate risk is by working with the right firms that that you're going to hire them, they're going to do their job properly and work well together. So if this is something that could be mandated, now on our design builds, we have full control of that. On other projects that are not design build, we try to get as picky as we can. We try to select the pursuits, the opportunities based on obviously the client, but more importantly, what consultants are on the team. So again, it's all about mitigating risk. And I don't remember the last time we secured work on stiff sum basis. Just that doesn't exist anymore, and then that's a great thing. So yeah, I would love to see it mandated from a contractor standpoint, absolutely, because again, based on everything we've been seeing up until now, it does help us mitigate risk.
Bruce, on to you.
Yep. I was very encouraged by Angelo's comments with respect to design build as a procurement process where them as GCs are out there doing the selection of the engineers and not so much the owner directly. And I think this is where, as part of my original comments, it really doesn't matter your procurement process where you're doing even a P3 and getting your consortium together, then how you select who the design folks are on that consortium can still use a QBS process. Absolutely, I would love to see again the philosophy of QBS enshrined in legislation for public procurements in Ontario, to cut across all ministries and all agencies and so on. I think part of the challenge here, and it does go to the side of the particular procurement methodology, is in a P3, in a design build, the government itself, the procurers, aren't the ones making that particular choice, right? It's a little bit of a different animal for that perspective. So the question becomes, how much direct procurement of engineering and architecture services are these public agencies doing? So, when you're talking about your big agencies, your IOs and your Metrolinks, it still happens. There's no doubt about that. It's just not always big news and so on. But as you get, and Angelo interestingly mentioned, amongst the universities, colleges, boards of eds, other municipal level public sector folks, I think really have a much greater need to do that, and to see that trickle down that way, I think would be terrific. But there's the part of me that ultimately says it's not going to happen unless you make them do it, right? And that's part of the challenge here. And we need to be able to better define, and perhaps, demonstrate and or quantify what is the problem we're solving by QBS as the solution.
Okay, thank you. And John.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, legislation would be the holy grail of QBS, such as what's the case in the United States. But I mean, stopping short of legislation, which can be a little bit prescriptive and restrictive in many ways if it's not crafted properly. Policy is also a great way to start as well. And I referred to some of the work that we're doing at the national level on that front. I mean, a good example of a strong policy is in Ontario, the broader Public Sector Procurement Directive, which I think we're all pretty familiar with by now. But even at the policy level, there can be kind of misunderstandings or confusions about the intent. For example, the BPS procurement directive in Ontario specifically excludes professional services from a requirement for competitive pricing. But it's not commonly understood that it does. And in fact, we often hear procurement officials at the municipal level and at the broader municipal level telling us, well, our hands are tied. We have to include price as an evaluation metric. And in fact, it's not true. So the most important thing here is developing a really strong understanding of what QBS is and what its benefits are, and guiding and directing public sector clients towards more of a quality-based or qualifications-based selection process, and making sure that it's understood properly, because the devil is always in the details, and it's important that those details are correct.
Perfect. Okay, we're running out of time. I have one very quick question, but again, it was referenced in a lot of the comments and in the question, and Angelo did refer to the idea of risk. Now, risk is significantly impacting the industry, both from an insurance perspective, where insurance rates are getting out of control because of the risk regime that's here, as well as it's causing some firms to not bid on projects because the risk is there, with how the project is either designed or the costing around it. So you have, I know a lot of municipalities are saying that, we have a lot of unbidded projects. And what do we do with that? So how will QBS help de-risk a lot of these projects, which will hopefully then drive down insurance rates, as well as encourage more bids on some of these public procurement projects? Who do I go for? Bruce, I'm going to go with you.
Sure. I think absolutely. I made reference to risk earlier. I go back to the research, the Georgia-Colorado study that speaks to the extent of reduction in cost or change orders and or schedule slippage, both of which become the risk issues, things that ultimately drive up change or drive up costs and results in claims or litigation taking place within projects. And again, here we're just talking an opportunity to significantly mitigate that, and in one case, through to 70% reduction in some of those things. So there is unquestionably a correlation then between a positive risk mitigation and the use of QBS.
Angelo.
Again, it goes back to what we've been saying from for the past hour or so. I'm going to speak from experience, and I've said this. I said this before. I will do my very best to secure a project if I know the right consultants are on it, because I know that the documents are well complete, and it minimizes my risk to change orders, to schedule slippage, and that always results in in a confrontation scenario with our client where I'm at the table having to negotiate something that unfortunately I have to negotiate, and again that opens ourselves up it opens ourselves to risk, which obviously it's money, and so again, QBS will enforce, will allow the right people to be on this on the project and minimize that for us.
Excellent answer. And John, the last word to you.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Sandro. Yeah, I mean, I'll just underline what both Bruce and Angelo have said. That risk calculation at time of tender is an important one for potential bidders to do. And we often get feedback from the general contractors that we work with about their preference to work with our firm. And I don't believe they're just sort of, patting our back to make us feel good, based on the strength and quality of the construction documents we produce. They often tell us that it is easier for them to bid our projects because they're more comfortable with the risk associated with doing the work based on the documents that we produce. Are our documents always perfect? No, of course not. There are going to be issues, wrinkles, gaps, omissions, and how we manage those through the construction process in terms of dealing with the changes that flow from that is also important. And again, QBS helps us to generate a reasonable and fair fee so that we can dedicate the required resources to the construction phase so that we can be as responsive as we need to be to the builders who are taking this huge risk when they take on our projects. So all of that is aided and benefited by QBS, in my opinion.
Well, if I could just add one more thing, Sandro.
Absolutely.
So many of you may be aware of this, but back 30, 40 years ago, the industry was very, very different than what it is today. Unfortunately, I never got to experience that, but all my teachers and my predecessors, they all talked about the old days. And the old days was that clients actually gave and paid, gave the needed time, but paid the right fees so that architects and engineers actually had the proper time and the proper fees to complete a design. So I really think back then it wasn't the QBS process per se, but the system uses these principles, and over the years we've lost that, and now hopefully we can move towards an era where we can relive those experiences.
Thank you all, gentlemen, for the great comments and great perspective and sharing your experience with us. I'm going to actually have the last word, and that is 8 years ago, we did an event with the CN Tower for its 40th year anniversary, and we brought in the original designers of that, the engineers and architects who designed that thing. And many of them were in their later stages of their careers and of their lives, to be honest. But what was interesting is we had the current operations manager of the CN Tower there as well. And he said that the CN Tower, 40 years later, is as structurally sound as it was when it was originally opened. And that is the value that having quality people work on a project really means. And I'm looking forward to having an update in 2 years when we do a 50-year anniversary event at the CN Tower. So with that, a lot of the comments and the questions in there in this discussion is the work that CDAO is actually doing. We're looking at quality of documents and making sure that the industry has a standard set of documents that they use to help with the confusion that goes on, that there's better communications between all aspects of the construction and design side. So that is the value this organization brings, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you, not only on QBS, but all the other areas. And with that, I pass it back to Sharon. Thank you all the participants, and thank you all those for submitting your questions and comments.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Great session. I think a lot of great questions in the Q&A chat as well, that we didn't quite get to everything, but some great discussion. And I love, personally, as the person representing interior designers, being a part of the design community, love the discussion representing the design side of this as well. We are going to take another quick break. We resume at 12:45 for our last, which will focus on standard contracts. Thank you.